Hello interwebs, I hope you are all doing well and welcome to my season review of the Orville New Horizons, or as it's alternatively known, the Orville Season 3. So as most of you probably already know, on this channel I've actually been doing episode by episode individual reviews of this entire season. So for this video, I'm not going to be sort of like looking at the specifics or nitty gritty of the entire season. I'll be talking about some specific stuff, but I wanted to pull out and just talk about this season as a whole, because as a lot of the discourse around the season has already discussed, this was a fantastic season of television, and one that quite frankly shocked me, most especially because while I've liked previous seasons of the Orville, season 1 and season 2, and thought season 2 was significantly better than season 1, I did not expect the vast jump in quality that this season brought with it, because I thought this was truly fantastic. And there's been a lot of discourse around this season, in part in relationship to like sort of a direct comparison to modern Star Trek right now with things like Star Trek Picard and Strange New Worlds and Discovery, as well as Lower Decks and Prodigy as well, and sort of saying like, this is the real Star Trek, this is the better Star Trek, or trying to like have the compare and contrast. And so I wanted to just do a little bit of discussion on that front to sort of talk about that a little bit, as well as talk about just the season on its own terms as a whole and my thoughts on the season as well. And let's start off the discussion there before I get to the more controversial stuff about like its place in relationship to modern Star Trek and things going on with the actual like Star Trek proper franchise. This show was clearly started off as Seth MacFarlane's pet project. Like, this is the thing that he wanted to get to make. Like, he made so much money for things like Fox and stuff like that, that he's like, let me make a Star Trek show. And he obviously couldn't do a Star Trek show for, various reasons, not owning the rights and things like that. So he's like, all right, I'm going to get this show. And it started off very much being a kind of like lukewarm comedy show. And I think that that's probably how he got the show made, right? That he wasn't able to just make a straight up Star Trek show. And so he said, okay, I'll do a parody show. But then it slowly morphed into something more and more serious over time, eventually leading to this season. And it's very clear that this show has become a sort of modern day Star Trek The Next Generation, right down to the fact that a lot of the people that work on the show, from just people behind the scenes, like doing production stuff, as well as writers on the show, like Brandon Braga himself, who was showrunner on Star Trek Voyager, Enterprise, and was a writer on Next Generation, as well as some of the Next Generation movies, coming in to work on the show, as well as some other writers as well that are working on the show. And because of that, this show just really feels like a continuation, and this season really felt like that the most, where it's dropped a lot of the humor, for the most part, to just really just kind of tell what Next Generation type storylines are. And one of the things that I really liked about this show, though, in comparison to Next Generation, and don't get me wrong, I love the Next Generation. The characters are fantastic and wonderful, and I don't think that this show is necessarily better than that. But one thing that I think is uniquely Orville is it feels much more laid back and down to earth. While this season does have our characters become much more centralized in the universe, like being someone like is apparently like the most important ship, what I still like about this show is you kind of get a little bit more of an everyman quality from this. Like the conversations on the ship that people have feel a little bit more laid back and just sort of everyday than you would get on Next Generation. While we still have like Riker, Rikering it up and things like that, there was a little bit more of a formality and stiffness to it. That this show, I think the Orville kind of breaks down a little bit more. And you get to see that in such great interpersonal relationships. And I really thought that that was just frankly great. But moving on from that, just getting into the Next Generation style storytelling, what I also really loved about this is that because they had a longer runtime, they allowed the storyline to just sort of evolve a little bit more naturally, get a lot more world building stuff here. While some episodes would take a little bit of time to get to the point of what their episodes were, they use that extra padded time to sort of give like, here's the context for this. Like we get whole episodes like bits laying like, we're going to explore this new area of space, but how do we get there? What's the treaty negotiations? I do like that stuff. There were times where I do felt it made the pacing of the show a little bit wonky. There were episodes that I do think dragged a tiny bit and were a little bit overlong, but on the whole, I just liked that storytelling aspect of it. I thought that was kind of nice and something you didn't get to really do in like Next Generation, where you just have more time to flesh out that stuff. So it's a mixed bag on that front, but I do think overall it worked. But let's actually talk about the stories, because in true Star Trek fashion, what this season did, I think that impressed me the most, was that it did not shy away from very didactical political storylines. Next Generation and all Star Trek really has always been didactic and political. Like, go back to the original series, Kirk was like literally quoting the Constitution at people and things like that. So Star Trek has always been political and didactic. But this show, more than most, I think it was just like almost every single episode outside of like one or two was about a political discussion. We got stuff about like abortions and, Christian nationalism to a degree, like a religious fervor being brought into politics. We got things like talking about LGBTQ and trans issues in really interesting, intriguing ways, and how that also interrelates with politics. We got also the Star Trekian message of like bringing people together through trust and belief, rather than separation and dividing people with things like the Kalon. And I thought that all of that was just so wonderfully interwoven. I really love that the show did not shy away from it. The other thing too with that I liked about this season is that, unlike Next Generation, where everything was very siloed, and they did have some recurring elements between episodes, the show, like kind of like Deep Space Nine, I think was probably the better example of this, is that like things weave through, like things that happen to characters in one episode came back in another episode, and ongoing like political stuff going on with like the Kalons and the Mocklins all also interweaved through the season. And we got to see things from previous seasons coming back up as well. And I love that continuity in a way that Next Generation was never allowed to do. Deep Space Nine got to do better, but still not as like well as we do today, while still allowing the show to feel episodic. Like still feel like you could watch an episode and you didn't need to like have watched 10 other episodes to enjoy it. And so I liked that quite a bit as something compared to like Star Trek Discovery or Picard. However, this does start to get me into my problems with the show in comparison to modern Star Trek, while also things that I really like about the show in comparison to modern Star Trek. And let me start with the negatives so I can start talking more about the positives. One of the things that I think is a problem with this show, and I want to kind of elucidate this, just because it's kind of the discourse that I had, is twofold. It is very clear to me that this is a show that was mainly made with the same mindset that the original Next Generation was in. Namely, that it's trying to teach people about issues, about certain perspectives and things like trans issues, for example. Yet, the show talks about those things in alien metaphor, which is part of a way that was like part of Gene Roddenberry's idea, right? About like taking things out of their current cultural context and allowing us to have discussions around it that are without the bias of our current political discourse. And I think that that's smart. Yet there is an element, and this is more pronounced in previous seasons, where it does feel like they're still otherizing people who actually exist. For example, like when they talk about trans issues in the show, and I think they do it this season really, really well. But there's no trans person there in the series, like a literal actual trans person, like a human trans person, to exist within the narrative. We get an alien character who is representative of trans narratives, and within her own society, Topa is trans, and I've talked about that in other videos, like she is a trans character within the Mocklin society, but it's still alien metaphor, and we don't get to actually see a trans person exist within the world. And as a result, it makes the show feel like, at times, like it is here just to educate and not necessarily be inclusive. And that is a problem that I had with older Star Trek shows like The Next Generation as well, where they would get episodes like The Outcast or Rejoined in Deep Space Nine, where they would talk about LGBTQ issues. And it was great, or for the most part, they were great. I have issues here and there, especially with when they were written, but they were decently well told and empathetic towards LGBTQ people, but still made us feel otherized, different, like we were alien, and not get to be included within the show. And it makes me uncomfortable because there is this problem where it's been throughout Hollywood that like Hollywood will try to tell the stories of LGBTQ people and get the accolades for it without actually including or benefiting the communities that they're talking about. We saw this with like people of color and the Black community, but I see it a lot with trans people where you see like an actor get an Oscar for playing a trans character and not a single trans person worked on the show or was talked to about the show, and sort of like this pitying look at trans people, like, look, we can educate about them, and you get the awards and accolades for doing something that like trans people live with every day of our lives. And I compare it to modern Star Trek, where we do have so many LGBTQ characters, so many trans and queer and people of color and disabled people within those shows, that I really like that, because it's saying like, not only can we talk about these issues and how they come up with certain characters, but they get to be included in this feature as well. They don't get to just be alien metaphor. And while I do think, in a large degree, the Orville, I think, dealt with trans issues better than modern Star Trek, at least in an explicit way, I think that aspect of it makes me uncomfortable. Now, modern Star Trek, I think, does other things really well. Like, they evoke queer culture really well, with things like in the episode "Forget Me Not" of Star Trek Discovery, where they like evoke the HIV quilt project in really interesting ways. Then characters just get to have like a queer found family. I think that those elements of the stuff, by allowing characters to actually exist as themselves within the narrative, allows those elements to feel more truthful and real in a way that the Orville never really does. And so I think that that's a missed opportunity in comparison to modern Star Trek that I think it fails at in a lot of aspects. And I think this also comes off the back of previous seasons of the show, where I think this season did, like, it's clear to me that the trans storyline they did with Topa was clearly, at least they got some people from like GLAAD or other LGBTQ organizations, or like a sensitivity reader to read over that, or maybe there was a trans writer who wrote it. I didn't check the writer off the top of my head, but it was very clear they were much more inclusive in learning about this stuff. But coming off that storyline comes off the back of like season 1 and 2 of Topa's storyline, which were mixing and matching and really confusing the metaphor of trans, intersex, and women's issues just generally, and gender issues just generally, in a way that felt very otherizing and got things wrong, and very just diminutive and condescending in a lot of ways too, and just didn't really work. Like, people praise About a Girl from season 1. I think About a Girl is absolutely terrible. I pat it on the back for trying, but it really gets a lot of this stuff wrong and mixes a lot of these things up, and does not make the metaphor clear. And as well as a result, it makes it very uncomfortable. And that comes from the fact that they probably did not include any trans or LGBTQ people or like people in those stories to write them. So when we come to season 3 and we get to those same stories, it allows, because the metaphor was bungled before, and while it's being used better now, like really well now, and being very well written, because it comes off the back of those things, those inherent problems that they baked into the story, it allows people to be misinterpreted. There were so many people that took the storyline with Topa this season to be anti-transgender, when very clearly, if you look at what the writers are saying, what the storyline is actually about respecting someone's bodily autonomy, and things like that, that the show was being very pro-trans in a lot of aspects, but because it hadn't made that metaphor clear, and it's coming off the back of those other problems from previous seasons, that it creates this issue. And to a degree, it's like, that's not the problem of this season, but it is a problem of this show. And so I think that element of it is a mistake that I think the Orville didn't do enough to really correct. Whereas I think modern Star Trek, like Discovery and things, made very similar problems. Like, look at how they did bury your gay storyline several times on that show. But the show has gone out of its way to like take time to correct those mistakes, like address them head on, and then try to make them better as the show moves forward. It's still imperfectly, and there's still problems. It's hard to do it when you're trying to correct the mistakes of the past from either previous showrunners or previous seasons or writers. But I think Discovery did it a little bit better than the Orville did, even if I do think that this season of the Orville addressed those issues in and of themselves in its own context much better. And so that's sort of like my major like comparison with the show. It does feel otherizing at times. And also there's something worth saying too, and this is just me looking at it, and I would rather hear someone else's commentary about it, maybe someone from the Black community. But there's also something that makes me a little uncomfortable, that the Mocklins, I believe, are all played by Black men, or at least our main one, like Bortus and Kryden, are played by Black men. And the entire Mocklin society is like toxic masculinity incarnate. Like, that's the entirety of Mocklin society, is just toxic masculinity to a T. And it kind of creates this uncomfortable coding of Black men being inherently more toxically masculine, which is a stereotype against Black men in our society today, which isn't necessarily true. And so again, I don't think that was intentional. I'm not saying like, oh, the show is trying to be overtly racist. It's just one of those things that like, you didn't really unpack that or think about that. And again, maybe I'm wrong in that, and I would love to hear people's thoughts in the comments. It's just something that like I caught on to, and it made me kind of like, I don't think that was intentional, but it's definitely not there. And so that's one aspect of it. But then, like I said, let's bring this to talking about some positives. I think that this show is just doing something different than modern Star Trek. I think modern Star Trek, for better or for worse, and I think some ways it works, like on Strange New Worlds and Lower Decks and things like that, and in other ways it doesn't, like Star Trek Picard, or more mixed in Discovery, which I like a lot of aspects of and don't like a lot of aspects of. But those shows have become much more beat by beat, much more exciting, propulsive, kinetic in a lot of ways. And they've done a good job of being able to slow down the storyline in a lot of ways, especially in shows like Strange New Worlds. I think did it the best. And I do think that that show is probably the best comparison to the Orville, but that show still has a much more kinetic, faster-paced, action-oriented style, even though I do think it does tell some really fun, exciting, and intelligent stories. And the Orville is a much more slower-paced show. Not to say it doesn't get action, but its pacing is much more languid in the same sense that The Next Generation was. Like, it's just, like, Generation is a very slow-paced show overall. And the Orville kind of, I think, mirrors that too. And I don't necessarily think one is better or worse. I think that you can still tell intelligent stories like you see on Strange New Worlds and Lower Decks and even Discovery with that type of storytelling, and it can be a little bit more entertaining and exciting to draw people in. But I also appreciate the Orville's slower pace and being to really explore a lot of these issues much more concretely and sit with them a lot more. And I think that that's a storytelling method I ultimately generally prefer, but I still like a lot of what modern Star Trek is doing. And as a result, I get really uncomfortable, especially since there's a lot of toxicity in these conversations. When people's I see people that I respect, there are big reviewers that I respect, they're like, the Orville's the best Trek right now. And I'm like, well, the shows are kind of trying to do different things. And you can certainly have a preference. But I think that Star Trek needed to evolve. And the Orville is kind of more of an extension of The Next Generation. I think that this shows that it can still work today. But I think that I like the modern franchise taking risks, and then shows like this also showing this storytelling method can work. And I like the competition between the two, because ultimately I think the competition between the two shows will make both shows better. I mean, it clearly made the Orville better. And I think that also made Star Trek better with Strange New Worlds and Discovery and things like that. And so I think the comparison can be helpful in a writing sense, writers looking at oh, that's interesting, I like that. But I dislike the comparison in the sense of people oh, this one's better, and pitting them against each other, because I ultimately think they're doing better things or different things from each other. And I kind of like having both. People like to pit things against each other when ultimately as consumers, to use that phrase, of these things, enjoyers of these things, we should be happy that we get both. It's good to have both. It's people saying, I stand Xbox, I stand PlayStation. It's no, both is good. Having both is good. They make each other better by having to fight each other, and having that competition, hopefully friendly competition, pushing each other to be better. And I think I like that, and so I hate being here I like this one better than the other one. I have preferences. I think Lower Decks is probably my favorite Star Trek show because I like comedy the most, and it kind of still also fits in that Next Generation mold that I like so much. Followed probably by the Orville, then Strange New Worlds. But I dislike pitting them against each other as some sort of battle royale, especially since those antagonistic framings are exactly what toxic communities thrive off of. You look at things Doomcock, Nerdrock, all these other toxic people. They thrive off of that exact framing of this show's better and the big companies, corporations are ruining your media. I mean, yes, companies like Disney and things like that are neutering franchises by making them sort of milquetoast instead of actually talking demonstrably about stuff. But that's a separate problem than these toxic fan bases that ultimately use it to stoke anger in people to usually rally against trans people or LGBTQ people or people of color being in things, instead of actually talking about the actual issue of corporations just sort of not actually doing things, trying to just play it safe and not actually allowing stories to be interesting, which is something I'm not seeing as much with Star Trek as a franchise. It's still a big multimedia franchise, so it's there's still limits on stuff, but I think that as a franchise, I think it's one of the most risk-taking franchises that's out there right now, especially compared to things like MCU and Star Wars, which are kind of getting a little bit rote at this point in my mind. So I'm not going to say I'm going to defend CBS, Viacom, or whatever, or Paramount, whatever you want to call it at the moment, and say that it's great, there's a great corporation, but neither am I going to be here and be I think modern Star Trek sucks and has been soulless, nor do I want to fall into that framing of the antagonistic, oh, the woke mob has destroyed Star Trek sort of thing. So at the end of the day, I think this is a great season of television. I have issues with it, but again, that's what makes art interesting. People always, again, this is what criticism has become on platforms like these, where it's you need to love or hate something, give it a star rating. How many stars is it? And if you criticize something, you hate it. It's no, I don't hate the Orville. I love the Orville, and I love that even the things that I dislike about it or I have issues with create interesting conversations. The comparison to modern Star Trek fascinates me because I think it draws out really interesting conversations about what does it mean to represent something well. And I think the Orville does certain things better, and the modern Star Trek does things better as well in different aspects. And I like the conversation that comes out of that. I think that that's cool, as opposed to being like, I like one better. I think that that's dull. That's a dull conversation to me. I think it's more interesting to me to have the conversation about what one does better, and what is this art saying, what does it do well, what does it doesn't do well. And for that, I really appreciate the Orville. Overall, though, fantastic season of television. I loved it. I'd love to hear your thoughts, though, on this season down below. Let me know what you thought of the Orville Season 3 or the Orville New Horizons. Fingers crossed we get a Season 4 of this show. Please, tweet at people and watch it on Disney Plus, most especially. I don't love Disney, but I do want this show to continue. I hope it does. If it doesn't, this season is a great place to end it on. I think the finale was really strong as a series finale, but I certainly don't hope it ends here. I hope there's more to come. So yeah, please support it, get Season 4 out there. But beyond that, I hope that you, as always, my friends, live long and prosper.